If you are following sim racing closely, then you are probably aware that Le Mans Ultimate, or rather the studio behind it, is still in financial trouble. Only a couple months ago, they had to lay off about 40% of their staff in order to stay afloat and reduce costs. And their future is very much on the line still. So they heavily depend on getting new customers and therefore getting content out there that people want. This Tuesday, they have released the Le Mans GT3 class, which includes 4 cars. Among that, there are other updates to the tire. There is a new platform which you're supposed to use for conducting multiplayer races, hosting servers and such. So it's time to have a bit of a review of what has been released a couple days ago and to kind of give you an idea whether or not this has the chance to keep the project going. The first thing I want to talk about is the pricing, and there are generally 2 ways to get access to the new content. The game is still early access, and I just want to kind of keep that in mind. You can argue about that there is no defined state for what early access actually means, and some games that are in early access might be completely premature, while other games in early access might be very far developed. I would see Le Mans Ultimate more on the further developed side of things because it is probably properly working already, just doesn't have all the features yet that it's going to have in the future. However, the game costs currently already 35 euros, which probably isn't going to be all the content that you need. If you want all the other content, other cars, more tracks, which 10 tracks, and then it is going to be 4 classes, LMP2, the hypercars, the GT3 that are new now, and the older GTEs, you will have to go for the season pass, which adds another 47 euro to the price. So in total, we're something like 82 euros, 83, something like 83 euros is what we are paying through Steam to get access to all content. With that, you would be sorted if you only want to play the multiplayer that is inside the game through the game's menu. However, there are more options now with the Race Control GG platform, which is kind of powered and developed together with SimGrid. If you don't know SimGrid, on SimGrid, it is offered to you as a third party, host your series, invite people to join your league and manage everything basically through that. There are a couple features that you have additionally if you go for a paid plan on this platform. For example, if you go for the highest tier, the Pro Plus membership, you will have temporarily, so kind of not owning the content, but you will get access to the LMU and R Factor 2 content. If you choose the yearly option, this is $84. It's a bit higher in euros. And if you want to pay it monthly, it's 17 euros a month. So you'll easily manage to get towards 200 euros a month if you go for the subscription. But that also includes access to being able to join leagues that are ran through the Race Control platform. There's some more stuff with driver reporting, more registration options for a longer period of time, blah, blah, blah. But the main thing, I guess, you would get access to the content temporarily until you stop paying for the membership. If you go for the 17 euros a month, as I said, it goes up to 200 euros. So that's a little more than iRacing. Even yes, I know on iRacing you pay each content piece individually. But again, all in all, we're talking about a early access product that has a lot of features and content, but is not a complete game. And you can get Automobilista and ACC, including all the content, and they are more finished games for the same or lesser of a price, for example. So it really depends what you are looking for. It's a newer game, so maybe a newer price makes sense. Also, given their situation, I completely understand that they need to make sure they have a continuous flow of money so they can do planning and develop the game further and get themselves out of the delicate situation they are in financially. So in the end, up to you. I think in comparison to the overall equipment that we pay for, so my rig and PC and all situation is probably 10,000 euros easily. So I would say personally, the game can cost some more money. It shouldn't matter in this hobby, so to say, as much. But yeah, everybody does their own choices there. So these are the options you have either through Steam, once 85 euro, or you go for a paid plan on Race Control GG, getting temporary access to the content. First, there's something general to say about the 4 cars that we are getting, which is the BMW M4 GT3. Then we have the Corvette, we have the Ferrari 296 GT3, and we also have the McLaren. The thing that we have to say about the Le Mans spec GT3s is that they have a little less downforce and less power than the cars we know from SRO. So when we compare the two things, we should keep that in mind. And yeah, kind of just make sure that we're not expecting the same top speed, the same lap times, the same cornering speeds, because the cars are a tiny bit different at the end of the day. It's not huge differences, I'd say, but just kind of so you keep that in the back of your mind. So it's time to start the driving, and we're starting with the BMW M4 GT3. I have chosen Bahrain as my testing ground because it has a good variety of corners. We have very slow ones where we need to brake from higher speeds, where we need the traction from slower speeds, where we have weight transitions there in the middle sector, in kind of fairly medium speeds, and there are also high-speed turns towards the end of the lap. And there's also one corner that is particularly hard to brake in the middle of the track with this very tight hairpin, which gives us a very good variety of corners on the track, which should show us all the potential car behaviors. I've already warmed up the tires, and some things we need to say first is that it appears that camber on the car really doesn't matter. So if you go higher, not really going faster. And it seems that almost lowest camber, or even the lowest camber, we're not meaning -5, we're meaning as close to 0 as possible, somehow seems to be the fastest way to drive with these cars. And on many cars, you will even see that with the lowest camber, the inside of the tire is always the hottest part, while only if you crank the wheel too much, the middle of the tire is going to be warm in the corner. But for now, I don't think that matters too much, but just because there are always people out there screaming that Le Mans Ultimate or R Factor 2, this is the best physics, this is the best game. All the games have issues. Some are bigger, some are smaller. It's certainly not realistic that the lowest camber by numbers is the fastest in all situations on a race car. So that to keep in the back of your mind. The other thing that we want to watch out for is the ABS. Because they advertise that a little, which with something like, I think, 40 hertz per tire that they're checking. I don't even know what the real cars are doing, how high the frequency is. But this has some major impact, and of course we need to figure out if actually we want to brake harsh into the ABS and just let go of the brake when cornering, or if it's actually better to stay away from the ABS, so more like an iRacing system. And in the end, the question there is the ABS more of a aid here in this game, or is it rather a fallback mechanism? This discussion is not going to get away, because real-life cars are different. Real-life driver feedback is different. And probably there are two realities at least. And you will have drivers who are slamming the brake and the ABS sorts them out because they have a car where the ABS works great. And some will not hammer the brake in the braking zone in real life because their car does not support that in the same way that another car does. I really want sim racers, especially following this channel, you need to step away from seeing things black and white. They are not. Real life is not black and white, never. And therefore, whatever implementation a game has, there are probably good reasons to do it that way, but none of these ways is the holy grail. None of that is likely the last realistic approach that we're going to see. So when we go into the driving finally, you will see that I'm not slamming the brakes here because of two things. One, the ABS engages rather harshly, and it starts to pull on the steering wheel left and right. And while this is a nice effect to have, gives you good feedback of the ABS system being active, it actually makes it trickier for you to judge where the car is actually going to end up by the point you want to turn into the corner. So it could be that it pulls to the left and you slide onto the curb before turning in, or it starts pulling to the right and you're kind of not turning in from the widest position anymore. So I have kind of now adapted to not braking fully so that I stay shy of the ABS and only triggered a little, so the effect on the steering wheel is not as much. But also I have the same effect kind of on the brake pedal with the SimuCube active pedal. So I almost have two feedback mechanisms here at play. Then we start with a BMW, not because, but just to talk you through the traits of this car a little bit. We can brake a little after the 150 meter board here. And you can hear the ABS has kind of a qualitative audio level to it. So if you slam the brake harsh, then the ABS will sound very loudly. And I'll just do it here for the next corner very harshly and just watch the steering wheel or my hands here. I think they're shaking a bit. I don't know if the 60 FPS of the camera are actually enough, but I can tell you that my power button of the Simucube 2 base came off from the vibrations. And you can hear that the ABS is fairly loud if we are aggressive with it, whereas if we trail slightly into the turn, you will not hear the ABS as loudly. So you get 2 feedback or 3 feedback mechanisms there in the steering wheel in terms of frequency of engagement and in terms of kind of loudness of the ABS effect, giving you a feedback of how much you're overdoing it essentially. And I guess that is good because you can fairly easy adapt to that and just brake about enough to trigger the ABS without overwhelming it, but without causing really the issue of the car starting to pull left and right. There are people out there who are just running the highest ABS setting because it engages the smoothest and it doesn't give you this effect of the steering wheel pulling left and right and vibrating as much. You can go lower. I drove as little as 3, which gives you a very sharp vibration on the steering wheel every time the ABS is engaging because it allows the tire to slip much more, but then it also needs to do a bigger correction. So, done with the ABS here. In terms of TC, it seems that you want the power cut rather low and the other levels a little bit higher, so the traction control and the slip angle a little higher. Actually, it would be good if they rename that a little bit, and then it would be more clear what setting actually does what. But maybe in another update. Let's talk about the BMW and how it behaves. And I'd say it's this most stable car, so to say. So it has the engine in the front, and it seems that engine, especially with a kind of half-empty tank here, forces the car to rather go straight in the turn. So on turn in middle of the corner, the car will be pretty neutral to understeer. You can probably set it more aggressive, but just the general behavior of the car is a neutral to understeer one in almost all corners from turn in to the apex. But as soon as you go onto the throttle, the rear end seems to be kind of nervous, very traction limited, and you need to feed in the throttle a little bit to not trigger the traction control too much. Sometimes you will be in a situation where the car is already straight, and when you then floor it, then perhaps the tire isn't up to temperature and it doesn't grip up as nicely, and you'll have the traction control interfere in places where you don't want it. But the game already has it in the controls options where you can bind a TC override button. So I can just slide it here, press TC override, and then it will allow that slide turn the TC off for the duration of me pressing that button. And there can on occasions be situations where you want to do that in order to just avoid the TC from engaging in places where it's not needed, over a bump or something, just to keep the momentum going forward. But it's not as extreme as an ACC, for example, where the TC definitely cuts too much whenever it cuts. So it's more smooth here with 3 settings available for the TC. You also have more options available to dial it into your liking. And then I would say we can almost jump on. I'll just do a bit of a push lap to give you a bit of the feeling of how the car responds. So on the straight, the initial steering, we need very little to get a response from the car, so this is good. But my main issue, I think, is always mid-turn, after the turn-in, that then there's very little effect you can have on the car's rotation once you have committed to the steering there. So kinda your entire corner is influenced a lot by how you manage to turn in the car, and there the trail braking phase is really crucial to set the car up for a little rotation. So just trailing a little, get the rear rotated, okay? And then you can stop that rotation again, but it's very difficult to create rotation in the BMW once you're in the corner. There you'd need to get creative with, I don't know, harsh throttle kicks or yeah, kind of trying to outplay the inertia of the rear end or something. But once you're in the corner, I feel there's always this bit of a dull feeling in the steering wheel. It helped me to turn on the force feedback effect of, I forgot what it's called, but it's the last setting in the force feedback options, where you can have like a permanent resistance in the force feedback, which I find is the better way to drive here, because otherwise you have a big drop off in steering forces after the initial turn-in, where then overall there's no difference in the resistance of the steering wheel anymore. So it's a bit unclear, what should I actually do? So I find myself often to just watch the tire widget, and when the tire turns red, I know I'm turning too much there. So let's move on to a car that is a little more agile. So now I've switched to the Corvette, and that one has the engine, well, it's a mid-engine car, has the engine very much to the back though. And of course that is going to change the behavior in terms of how it turns in, how it slows down, how it builds traction at the end of the corner. And probably if you've driven LMU before, the hypercars or any other car, since there are no tire warmers, coming out of the pits is very low grip. And if you've played Automobilista with the IMSA license, it's the same thing. In GT3s, hypercars, LMP2, there are no tire warmers, so the first couple laps really don't offer a lot of grip. You're easily sliding about, so just make sure to take care here. Something about the Corvette that viewers also already seen in the race I did yesterday is if you look at the numbers in the dash, it doesn't seem to be like a unispace font they are using there, so the numbers keep jumping left and right the entire time, and it drives me kind of crazy. So I'm looking ahead into the distance to ignore that a little bit while we warm up the tires here. We can probably also be a little aggressive here, just getting temperature in them. We can watch that live here in the menu as well. Just get some core temperature going so the surface doesn't cool out as easily. And you can see I have all the options here. Even if I'm aggressive with the car, there's really no problem. It's unlikely to use it apparently. Only on the brake, maybe it's a tiny bit nervous, but here you can pretty much do anything. And it's hard to say something about it. Let's say I don't see that the same type of aggression on rear cars, or the rear cars being as tolerant there. But we care about the driving with warmed up tires anyway, so let's ignore when they are cool a little bit. Temperatures coming up, I think will just about be 60 degrees starting the new lap. So let's go for that. The top speed in this is a little higher, but of course setup differences. The wing here by default is significantly lower on the Corvette than it is on the BMW. And the rotation is a very different one. While the BMW struggles a bit or is hesitant to turn into the corner, the Corvette is much more willing to go for the turn. You just crank the wheel and basically you have much more rotation available than you need for the turn. So if you just turn it in, it's almost going to over rotate. And if you add a bit of trailing, you will definitely over rotate. So just doing this here easily can rotate too much and even spin. So it's not like this is super easy or you can overdrive to your liking. There's definitely a penalty if you risk too much. But I also feel you always need to do a tiny bit of sliding in all the cars, right? But especially when the cars kind of on their own have that rotation available without the driver having to create it, then the task of driving feels like always being about to carefully tap into that amount of rotation that the car and the tires can really manage, instead of more like the ACC driving, that would be, it is up to the driver to figure out how to create any rotation essentially, and then trying to keep that rotation alive. And that I think is the main perception difference in how the cars drive. In ACC, you have to really make an effort to make the cars rotate, either with the setup or with the driving and very careful trailing and somehow adding grip into the front tires and getting the rear loose. While here, the looseness is always there. You just have to decide to take it, but there isn't much fidelity needed, so to say, to create the rotation. The fidelity here is about just tapping into as much rotation as the car and tires can manage in any given situation. So the driving becomes a bit different than you are used to perhaps from ACC or iRacing or wherever you're coming from. So let's go a bit faster here. Or let's try at least. Very little ABS engagement. This is also one thing I felt the BMW has a bit more issues there, keeping the grip on the tires under braking. Maybe the brakes are just stronger and that's why the ABS engages more as well. But here on the Corvette, I found it easier to deal with the ABS and also much easier to stay outside of the ABS. And I also don't get as much issues with the ABS under braking with it pulling the car left and right. Also, the response here of the car is a bit better. We need less steering and less sudden steering to make direction changes, so we can just and have to be more smooth on the steering wheel as with the BMW, because here the rotation is always available and we need to be careful to not use too much. And then it always feels like it's not as extreme as with the GTEs, but you always slide the rear around the car in a way. And it seems the cars still have plenty of yaw, so the car pointing in a different direction than it is actually driving. But I feel it's not as extreme as it used to be in some R-Factor 2 days. But what I'm missing is this one grip point is just not available. It doesn't really feel like there's this one rail, so to say, that you can stuck the car onto and play around that rail. Here it's much more, I'm not gonna use the word, but it is less sharply defined what is the optimal grip of the tire, and you can choose a bit with which amount of yaw you want to go around the corner. Do you drive it understeery? Do you want to drive it as a four-wheel drift? Do you want to drive it more oversteery? That is pretty much up to the driver, and over a race distance it probably makes sense to make sure you're using all four tires equally, else you're starting to get balance issues over the course of the stint. Let's move on to the Ferrari. Okay, I got the Ferrari out of the garage, loaded the full setup, which are done by an esports driver, so they're not complete garbage. And let's see how it compares to the others. Of course, the sound is, well, what we know from the Ferrari. Not as loud, not as sporty, just a kind of muted permanent scream, so to say. But what you'll notice is that on the brake, it is pretty fantastic, honestly, and you don't have to worry about it too much whether or not you're triggering the ABS. So in that regard, it's not as sensitive as the BMW or the Corvette, and you can just brake pretty harsh and turn in, and the front will just follow your steering input. So it can quite take a good amount of combined grip, braking and turning, and it will convert it. It doesn't seem to be that limited there. And at the same time, even though the front is super responsive and loves to change direction, you never feel like the rear end is stepping out. So it is not as nervous as the Corvette is on turn-in, while at the same time, it seems to turn more willingly without getting the rear end loose. So it almost feels like the rear end of the car finds its way to pull itself to the inside of the corner and kind of claw into the tarmac, while the front end is allowed to do whatever, be aggressive with the direction changes, and will always bite. And the rear is very supportive here of whatever the front end is asking from the car. This comes maybe the tiniest issue you're gonna have in that regard is that the car is pretty, I'd say in comparison, is a bit more understeery in high-speed turns. Perhaps there's something you can still do about that in the setup. But the stability that you have on corner entry, reliability that the car gives you on corner entry comes at a small cost, so to say, in terms of high-speed, understeer, or too much stability. More aspects of the car then would be that in the middle of the turn, because it's in this slightly understeery state, as you go onto the power, let's see it here, a bit deep, or no, could still do it. That's the surprising thing here. You go onto the power initially, there's going to be some traction, but as the car comes out of the understeer and starts leaning into the rear, there's a small delicate situation where the rear is a tiny bit vulnerable, and probably that is in line with a bit of a turbo lag that the car just has. So initial throttle is not going to provide much power. But then when the turbocharger spools up, the power is going to release, or the torque is going to release. And that is also then when you have to take a tiny bit more care. But you can be really aggressive into the turns, throw it in, and then as you step onto the throttle, you will start creating that additional rotation. And then only as you open the steering, there's a small moment in time where you want to take care a bit. Another thing that I see here is that when you have that much front end in all situations, on the brake, high speed, low speed, and it will always convert the front end, then there is a tiny bit of sensitivity in this situation in high speed corners, because the front dives down a little bit, the rear comes up, and the aerodynamics balance also shifts a tiny bit forward. And here in the next corner in particular, where we're braking kind of in a turn, if you brake too much here and turn in, the rear end is going to get more issues, at least, than with the other cars we've been trying so far. When I drove here on Bahrain, and I don't know how track specific the BOP is in the game, I felt like the Ferrari, Corvette, and also the McLaren, they were quite a bit faster than the BMW, but that doesn't mean it actually is. But it was easier for me to just do 2-3 laps and beat the BMW time. But I think this is a situation that is yet to develop really, and we shall see how the cars are. But there's a pattern that I'm discovering here, and that is that the Ferrari here has a bit less of this floaty or vague feeling, where once you turn into the corner, you get this mushy feeling in the force feedback on the other cars, where you don't really know how much you have to steer, how much the car is still to convert. I feel here in the Ferrari, it somehow is more clear, and it seems more planted on the road and a little more communicative as to what you need to do as a driver. And this is the same pattern in the hypercars really, where there just seems to be more detail to the Ferrari than all the other cars. So there's something consistent in this game where the Ferraris turn out nicer at the end of the day. So probably my advice is going to be, if you want to try out the GT3s and you don't know where to start, brand affiliation tells me you want to do the BMW. The external sound of the car is great and very much on point with the real car. But if you want to have probably the most precise, or the most, I don't know, the best experience, let's just say it this way, it is probably also the Ferrari that has the biggest detail in the driving that I would say you can feel. And even here in this situation, when you are kind of going towards this mushy force feedback feel, there's still a bit more detail available than in the other cars. But this is all semantics at the end of the day. I think the overall pattern of how the cars drive is there, but we definitely feel the differences between the car, which I feel is a huge aspect. And that is something I also don't really feel on iRacing, where you definitely have to drive all the cars more or less the same. And I feel there's more different and more option here between the different cars, which is a very positive aspect. Let's move on to the last one of the bunch. Last but not least, we are going to drive the McLaren that also comes free with the update, so you don't even need the DLC for that car. The difference really in the car is that it kind of combines a few of the traits of the other cars, and it feels like the most in the middle of them all. So it gives you probably a good idea of how the GT3s drive in the DLC, which means you can just get the game if you don't have it already, or if you don't have the DLC but the game, you can just go and drive the McLaren to get a first idea how the GT3s are going to be, and then kind of take this video to get an idea of how the other cars are going to compare to the McLaren here. When I say it's in the middle, what I mean is that it is not going to be as aggressive on turn-in as the Ferrari. It doesn't have the same amount of combined grip into the turn. It's going to be very predictable and linear how it turns into the corner, and you can be a little wrong with your braking input, can be a little too much, can be a bit too little, you can be a bit wrong with the steering angle, but the car is ultimately going to turn in, so it's a bit kind of tolerant to driver mistakes in that sense. And then middle of the corner, it will just keep rotating at kind of the same rate as it did on entry, and it's not really overwhelming. You can drive this pretty calm, and it's very rarely going to surprise you. Then on exit, it's probably the car with easily the most traction of them all. So this will be a situation where you can even experience some corner exit understeer here. And also with the throttle application, that means you can be much more aggressive than in the other cars, where the BMW is a bit delicate, hard to find the traction. Same in the Corvette, you really need to manage the amount of rotation carefully to not overdo it in order to kind of squeeze out the optimal lap time out of the car. But here in the McLaren, it's kind of a bit more fault-proof, has the same type of high-speed understeer that the Ferrari has a bit, while at the same time, nothing of the traits of the other cars comes through as extreme here on the McLaren. It seems though the more rearward the engine is in the car, the more traction it has on exit, so it will be very interesting. See, here's no TC engagement whatsoever. It will be very interesting when the Porsche comes to the game, which has the rear, well, has the engine even sitting further to the rear, which makes me think that we're going to see even more traction in the Porsche, and that will probably spark some issues of corner exit understeer, or even so much grip that it doesn't really need the traction control, and drivers potentially need to push the button in order to override the TC if it ever engages or something, to keep any rotation alive. So there's some things to look forward to should the other cars GT3s arrive in time, but as far as I know, there has been no announcement when that is actually to come. There's a bit of pitch sensitivity on the brake and higher speed turns, but it's not overwhelming. It's very linear and predictable, nothing that should overwhelm you if you're not completely new to sim racing. And then I feel probably you can notice also how freely I'm talking here driving the McLaren. It's the car that kind of needs the least attention and is the easiest to get into the corner without worrying too much. So it's actually the perfect car to start, maybe with LMU or with the GT3s in this game. And you don't really need to go for the DLC unless you are a diehard Ferrari, Corvette or BMW guy. And then you want to drive something that's a bit more interesting than the McLaren here, that can be a little underwhelming is the wrong word, but I think you will have worked through the patterns of this car fairly quickly, and maybe you want something that's a bit more in-depth, offers a more bigger variety of behaviors, and then you probably want to try the Ferrari, as it's quite different. If you want to be challenged as a driver, it's the Corvette. And if you just want to drive the greatest car of all time, of course you go for the BMW. Let's talk about the races here a little bit. So I did one of the multi-class races that was up in the game for selection yesterday evening. Overall, it all worked. I think that's really good. They also copied a few of the UI elements pretty much from ACC. So the whole starting procedure of whether or not your car is in the correct spot is pretty much indicated the same way as it is in ACC. Also, you get kind of the same overlay when you're actually starting the race to know your speed, that you're not speeding while the green light phase has kind of started. But yeah, just kind of a compliment there to ACC that they've defined an industry standard there almost. So that's working pretty neatly. What I didn't feel in the race quite so much was how the tire actually worked, or if there were tire phases, or how the tire wear worked. I know in ACC we have kind of a very good grip for the first couple laps. Takes a lap or two to get to that optimal grip, but then the drop off is rather sharply. Also, we wear the rear tires a lot more in ACC than the fronts usually, because they also wear a lot on the straight where the car is being accelerated by a lot of power. And that always leads to balance changes throughout the stint that we have in ACC, and I couldn't quite feel that here in LMU, where it seemed like the tire wear, at least for me in the Corvette, was very similar front to rear, so I didn't have any balance issues. Perhaps as a driver, when you steer too much or so, you can create a disbalance towards understeer, or maybe if you overdrive the rear end, you could cause something that would result in more oversteer throughout the stint. But as I said, in my race, I could only feel that the grip overall was decreasing a tiny bit, but it didn't have these phases that we kind of experience in ACC. Also, I wasn't able to really feel a difference in terms of balance coming from the different amount of fuel. So when the fuel amount was less in the tank, I didn't feel a shift towards under or oversteer, and the same was kind of true when I came out of the pits. The car drove the same kind of still, and also the lap times were the same kind of still. So I felt there was a bit of depth missing here, but of course it was just one race, a bit of experience still to be gathered here. Maybe you feel it with more laps, but I felt it was just more pronounced in ACC in general than it is here, perhaps. Then, as I already talked about, the starting procedure, that has all worked. The multiplayer has worked. Joining the session has worked, even though I would, if they already start taking things from other games, which is perfectly fine, then they should also take kind of the information that you get in iRacing, for example. When you're on a practice server and you've signed up for a session, then there are big green flashing buttons telling you to join the official session. And here in LMU, it's a mere message in the chat box telling you, hey, it's 3 minutes to your race. And that message was literally visible. I checked for 12 seconds. And if you're driving and you're reading the chat and you're doing corners and driving a fast car, perhaps you'll focus on a lot of things, but not on a random chat message mixed in with all the other people joining or leaving the server or going to the pits or whatever. I just didn't notice. So it would be probably better to have this bigger on the screen. Just go to iRacing, see how they do it, because they solved it. Then I'm still not a big fan of this whole virtual energy stuff. It makes sense because it's in the rulebook in real life and they use it to better BOP the cars. But for you, really, that only means, same as with the hypercars in the GT3, it just means you kind of need to do two calculations. You first need to figure out how much % of energy you're using per lap, and then you need to figure out how much fuel per lap you actually need, and then calculate the fuel ratio that you really need to set up. So you're using 3% of energy still, but you only need 2 liters of fuel for that for the lap, so you would have to set your fuel ratio accordingly. It would be better, I think, if they would just have an auto button here with a bit of a margin, and it would also make a lot of sense that if you went to the pit, that you could somewhere see your consumption of the last couple laps that you did, because this doesn't exist here. This only exists here when you're going through the menus that you have in the car on the bottom left of the screen. Of course, we'd have to do some laps now to see it, but then you would see the fuel usage and you'd see the virtual energy usage, and then you would have to calculate what your ratio between the two really needs to be, how much fuel you actually need to carry while still sitting on 100% virtual energy. Another thing that I want to just quickly highlight here is that some of these menus, you will see that they have a button or an arrow at the very bottom, which means you can scroll through these menus. And sorry, but I do not like that at all, because during driving, you're already busy with a lot of stuff, and having a menu on the screen that kind of needs scrolling through. And I think there are even more options on the hypercars, for example, because you can adjust the roll bars in real time and things like that. It is a bit annoying to figure out where you are, and either configure buttons on your steering wheel, or if you don't have POV switches on your wheel, figure out the keyboard or something, and then going down here and seeing how low you are, and then it jumps back to the top, and then it's a bit annoying. Just add another page, guys. Add another page, and it's solved. Because this here is a bit annoying to do on a single page, or here going through your settings with a motor map in the hypercars, and having to scroll here is just not the way that it should be, I think. Let's do a bit of a summary. The question initially was whether or not this update has the potential to help LMU and Studio 397 to fill their pockets a little bit in order to keep the development going and keep the company afloat. They are definitely trying with a price point that I think for an early access game that has a variety of features but is certainly not finished, is at least comparing to the other available sim racing titles a bit steep, but then again, it is not entirely out of proportion. I think if you're starting with sim racing, this is probably not the title you want to go for, because it might disappear and then maybe your money is gone for. But if you have all the other sims already and you have a big sim racing setup with a couple €1,000 invested already, then probably it doesn't matter too much if you also get LMU and all the DLCs involved. If you just want to try it out, I think it's a perfectly fine option, which is the one I took, to just pay a single month of Race Control GG, where you get all the content temporarily. And if you like it, then okay, you can still buy it, or you can extend the subscription. Or if you don't like it, you just cancel the subscription, you lose access to the content, and that's that. If you're already sure that you're going to play it for a longer period of time, which I can perfectly understand because it is not bad, I'll go into it in a second, then yeah, just go for it either on Steam if you are mainly driving it through the in-game multiplayer options, or if you are trying to drive it in your own league, or if you're organizing a league, of course, then perhaps you need the Race Control GG stuff to join and organize the races there. You can also host your own service on Race Control GG. And it only costs like €1.50 for a 2-hour session or something like that. So this is perfectly reasonable. Then I would love to see them extend their dedicated options towards LFM, for example, because A, there's a 200,000 people strong community. Of course, there's going to be some overlap with the people they already have, but I think there's already a financial argument to talk with LFM and giving them access to the dedicated servers and them hosting the races as well. Perhaps there needs to be a paid option as well, because it seems Race Control GG subscription takes part of the sum and gives it back to LMU. So there's a kind of closer collaboration there than just giving the dedicated server to LFM. So perhaps there can be an arrangement with LFM that you pay on either side and then you can use the LFM features, or you pay on LFM and you can use the LMU features or something like that. I don't think that's a perfectly unreasonable idea, at least. The content itself. I feel the cars do drive unique. They all have their character and they all drive different enough, and they all drive different in a credible way, right? The more the engine is in the back, the more the car is gripping up, like the McLaren, for example, in terms of traction. The more the engine is in the middle, the more willing the car is to rotate. The more in the front the engine is, the more stable the car is on entry, and the more nervous it is on exit. And these traits come through here. And I think they come through here enough to really tell the cars apart, even in a blind test that would work, I think. It is not as pronounced, I feel, as it is in ACC, for example, but it is also a particular strength of ACC to feel the differences in the cars and get them across really pronounced. In iRacing, for example, I feel everything is more muted. The differences in the cars are not so clear. So LMU is somewhere in between there and much closer to ACC in terms of feeling the differences between the cars, but not in terms of driving style. I mentioned it earlier, in ACC, you always have to kind of struggle and push to create the rotation on the cars, and rotation is something that is rare to have. And I feel in LMU something rotation is something that there's more than enough available almost at all times in most of the cars. So you have to control how much rotation you're actually tapping into to not overdrive the car. And I feel this is just the way you approach the game is you drive a bit more careful in LMU. You have to see how much you push it. In ACC, you push like crazy, trying to desperately create that rotation and keep it alive. And you need to be quite aggressive with that. So this is a difference in approach, and you feel that when driving. In ACC, I'm always hyper focused and I'm sweating. It's physically wearing. And in LMU, the race I did was much more relaxed. I feel I didn't produce as much heat myself because you have to push the cars much more carefully, so to say. Also, the hypercars, I think they kind of received a similar tire update where the grip is maybe a bit more pronounced. The more downforce you have, the higher the speed of the car, I think the more clear it is. Also, the drop off in grip after the peak is not as extreme, so there's like a second security layer now which still lets you catch the cars, I feel, in a credible way still. And then there is this ABS bit that I still want to mention, where I feel they did a good job getting it across into the force feedback, but I think it might be a little too much even, because it affects your ability to go straight with a car. And simply from watching real life onboards, I am not able to see this type of behavior where the cars go aggressively left and right under braking because of ABS interference. So maybe they overdid the effect there a tiny bit, but I understand what they're trying to deliver there. Much better it is when you have the chance to have an active pedal to get the ABS effect through there and actually turn it off in the steering wheel instead. That would be really nice for me. Would be easier to stay straight, because right now I get the feeling that you're staying out of the ABS in a straight line because the car is not going straight anymore, instead of it actually being a problem for the for slowing down the car. I will definitely want to hear your opinions. I'm trying to go for more multi-class races in particular, because this is the core aspect of the race. WEC is about multi-class racing, and now with this DLC, this will finally be possible at all. Of course, there were the GTEs before, there were the LMP2s, but the real thing is only the real thing when you have the cars that are doing this in real life. So now with the GT3s, the hypercars, maybe the LMP2s in between, we can now have the multi-class races how they are in real life. And I think this is the core aspect of the entire game. So I think now this game has a shot to actually be what it's designed to be at the end of the day. So I'm very interested to see how people pick this up, how you pick this up, how you like this. So please let me know in the comments. And the most important thing, if you go for the comments, don't be religious about it, please, because reality is not that black and white. It is not that easy to assess, and most sim racing titles have realistic or credible approaches to mimicking, simulating real life. There isn't this one right braking method. There isn't this wrong one braking method. And I'd like you to have more differentiation in your comments as well. And I'll simply kind of just block everyone who doesn't have any adult manners in the comments. But other than that, I'll try to see you on Sunday for another stream, multi-class, Le Mans, if I can find the time, in LMU. Maybe we have Ulsterman in voice as well. And then I'll see you very soon, hopefully. Thanks for tuning in, and bye.
About the relationship with SRO, so the fact that all the contents, will anyway be also featured in Evo sooner or later. We just finalizing some details. So.